And get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chinmoy Gurujani. I am an adjunct associate professor with the Division of Forensic Psychiatry. And today I am delighted to introduce Dr. Andrew Furman, a distinguished psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, educator, and leader at Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Furman serves as professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences and as an eminent physician at Emory, where he's also associate dean for faculty affairs. He received his undergrad degree from Williams College, concentration in religion and the history of ideas, and earned his MD from the Emory School of Medicine. He went on to complete his internship in internal medicine at the University of Washington and returned to Emory for his psychiatry residency, serving as chief resident at the Grady Memorial Hospital. Dr. Furman teaches across many levels of Emory's academic community. He works closely with medical students and residents, and also contributes to the leadership development program at Emory's Gazetta Business School. He also holds affiliated faculty appointments in comparative literature and the psychoanalytic studies program at Emory's Laney Graduate School. His scholarly work focuses on the integration of the humanities into medical and psychiatric education, the professional formation of physicians, and the pedagogy of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. And we touched upon some of that in our discussion earlier today. As all of you know, I'm standing in today for Dr. Jungjin Kim, who was unable to host the webinar due to some unexpected last-minute engagements. Dr. Kim regrets being unable to attend today and has asked that I share with everyone that Dr. Andrew Furman was a formative mentor for Dr. Kim during his time at Emory. Dr. Furman's mentorship was not only educational, but also transformational. Dr. Kim notes that his current work continues to reflect the influence of Dr. Furman's integrative and humanistic approach to psychiatry. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Andrew Furman.
Well, let me share my screen, and thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. Continue to share. There we go. For the invitation to do grand rounds. Thanks to you all. Dr. Kim extended the invitation to myself and my wife, who is also a supervisor and a psychologist of Dr. Kim's years ago, and she regrets not being able to participate this morning. Again, thanks for the kind introduction. What I'm going to do for the next hour or so is probably a little different than many of your grand rounds prior, but to think about the nature of the humanities and how the humanities can help us understand medical and psychiatric education, or we can think of it even more broadly in health education. My ultimate goal is to leave you with more questions than answers, and to leave you with the idea that human beings are inordinately complicated, and that's a good thing for our field. I start with this introductory slide. This is a depiction from a manuscript from the 1100s of the 7 liberal arts. And if this were a seminar, we'd be able to have a conversation about that. But my guess is most folks don't know what those original 7 liberal arts were. The original 3 were grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And then the 4 that were added to that were arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And with the last 4, it's sort of fun to think of them as arithmetic, and then geometry, which is arithmetic in space, music, which is arithmetic in time, and then astronomy, which is arithmetic in both space and time. All 7 of these liberal arts would lead eventually to the study of philosophy, which was the ultimate goal of the liberal arts. And I'll get into the nature of the liberal arts and the humanities in depth in just a few moments. But I'll start off with no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. And the learning objectives, I'll read them quickly to you. Participants should be able to utilize the humanities-based theories that I'll speak about to improve psychiatric and health education in general. Participants will be able to describe the humanities-based curriculum and its role in clinical medicine, and be able to recognize the core concepts of a humanistic approach to mental health pedagogy. As I begin, I put up this disclaimer slide, which is to say I'm going to show a lot of art and a lot of and read a lot of number of poems. None of these pieces of art or poetry were written by me. All of these are out in the public domain or being used in fair use ways. So again, all works of art or poetry used in this presentation are part of the public domain or used in ways consistent with limitations on exclusive rights and the fair use provisions of the United States Code. So again, I didn't create any of the poems or any of the pieces of art. We'll start with a little piece of a poem to get us sort of going as to why I think what I'm about to talk about is important for us in the health professions. It's a line from a poem by William Carlos Williams, who probably many of you know, in addition to being a poet, was a practicing physician. And the line is, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." I use poetry in my education of my medical students and residents often to help them understand the human condition in ways that our typical biopsychosocial model does not. And the point of my seminar with my residents and medical students is, again, to expand their way of thinking about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a human being with illness, or what it means to be a human being in general, and how there are many ways of understanding that, and how physicians, in tapping into those other ways, might be able to better understand their patients in more complex, nuanced, and subtle sorts of ways. I'm aware, however, and my guess is many of folks in the audience, that poetry and art is something that's alien to often to physicians, and many folks in our field have eschewed any sort of study of this. Indeed, they kind of went to college and said, "I'm going to study chemistry or biology," as a way of not having to deal with the humanities or particularly the arts. And as sort of as a way into this, I referenced the Williams poem a moment ago, is to start with, again, a snippet of a poem by Marianne Moore called Poetry. And she starts it off really, I think, provocatively. She says, "I too dislike it," thinking and talking about poetry. "There are things that are important beyond all of this fiddle. Reading it, however, with the perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine." And she continues in poetry that poetry can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them. We're going to be speaking a lot for the next hour about imaginary gardens and real toads, or imaginary toads and real gardens. For in many ways, our work in mental health is in that realm of the imaginary gardens with real toads. So as I start out, lay a little groundwork for what the medical and health humanities are, how they can be sort of thought of in psychiatric pedagogy, how we might think of them helpfully in the nature of our work, how we think about our patients. But to ground us, here are some definitions to be thinking about. Pedagogical definitions that the health humanities employ methods, concepts, and content from one or more of the humanities disciplines to investigate illness, pain, disability, suffering, healing, therapeutic relationships, and other aspects of medicine and healthcare practice. And even more importantly, I think they employ methods, concepts, and content in teaching health professional students how to better understand and critically reflect on their professions with the intent of becoming more self-aware and humane practitioners. And we're going to talk a fair bit about understanding and critical reflection over the next little bit. So like most sort of humanities kinds of talks, we need to go back many thousands of years. And I think this is a really helpful way of thinking about what we're going to talk about for the next little bit, and to think about the nature of our forms of knowledge and science in medicine and the disciplines that we use to think about how we know things. Often we don't spend much time thinking about how we know, but I think it's really essential for us to spend a little time with those ideas, because they inform the nature of the pedagogy that I'm about to talk about, and I think inform the nature of the work that we do as healthcare practitioners. So going back to Aristotle, which is often where folks start, in his Nicomachean Ethics, he formulated a series of ways of knowing or forms of knowledge. For Aristotle, ethics wasn't simply what we would now think about how to solve what the moral thing to do is or what the right thing to do is. I mean, he obviously talked about those ideas. But even more importantly, I think he talked about how we know things and how we, in knowing these, can help answer questions in different ways. And he sort of had them in a hierarchy, but I'm not sure it's necessarily hierarchical or necessarily helpful to think of them hierarchical. But I'll talk about three that are incredibly important, I believe, for what we do as healthcare practitioners, certainly as physicians. So for Aristotle, his first way of knowing he called techne, which would be sort of translated loosely as art or craft or even more accurately, technique. And for Aristotle, techne meant knowing how to do something. The technical aspect of something. So if you needed to build a bridge across a river, techne would be your form of knowledge, how to build something. And this is obviously incredibly important for our work in medicine, how to do certain things. Yet Aristotle obviously didn't stop there with his forms of knowledge. He continued on about that and posited as well something called episteme, which we would think of sort of broadly as scientific knowledge. These for Aristotle and for us as well are universal. They're context independent. And for Aristotle, it's a way of knowing why things happened. So much of what we do in medicine and much of how we teach medicine is a combination of techne and episteme, the scientific basis for things, how we understand things, why things happen, and then the techne, how to actually do something. But Aristotle didn't think that these were the only ways of knowing. Indeed, he posited a number of other ways. And for our purposes, I'm going to include, and I think importantly, something called that Aristotle called phronesis, which is translated in a lot of different ways, but I think most helpfully is practical wisdom, which in many ways is a combination of techne and episteme. It's a deliberation, a conscious deliberation about values with respect to praxis. And importantly, it's context dependent. It isn't context independent like episteme, which is a broad way of understanding things. Phronesis is to say, I have a very unique problem that's individual and context dependent right in front of me. How do I think through this and understand this using both techne and episteme to inform that decision? Eventually, Aristotle would then get to philosophy and Sophia as the final way of sort of thinking through of problems. I mentioned praxis before. Phronesis gets to praxis. Praxis generally means is the conscious willed action that through which theory or philosophy is transformed into a practical activity. And for our case, the practice of medicine or the practice of psychiatry. So I want you to keep those ideas in mind, techne, episteme, and phronesis, about how we know things and what the various forms of knowledge are that inform our practice. We'll jump ahead many, many thousands of years to 1910. Most medical history of medicine lectures include some reference to the Flexner Report. Abraham Flexner was an educator hired by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching to issue a report on the state of medical education in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. You all know about it. It revolutionized medicine in the United States. It was incredibly important in terms of medical education. The recommendations that you all are familiar with, I'll go through very quickly, were to tie medical schools and hospitals to academic and university centers. It implored medical schools to be scientific, empirical, and intellectually rigorous, to be rational and evidence-based, have a laboratory focus, objective and a systematic assessment of student assessment, and then to expand the pre-medical admissions requirements for medical schools. You all know this. Again, this reformed and greatly changed American medical education. In many ways, it was patterned after Central European medical schools, and things changed in the United States in enormous ways. So that's what we typically think of when we think of the Flexner Report. But Flexner didn't stop with those recommendations. He also had humanistic and humanities-based recommendations as well. And he said that education in the sciences was an instrumental minimum for education as a physician, and that alone was inadequate for medical practice. For dealing with the more subtle elements, I would say, phronesis, Flexner advocated a varied and enlarging cultural experience in order for the physician to fully apprehend his greatly modified ethical responsibility. So it's important to think again of the Flexner Report as modifying how we think of medical schools and them being objective and scientifically based, and also having a humanities base for the complex questions. It's important to also add that the Flexner Report, while revolutionizing American medical education in really positive ways, also had incredibly important consequences in less favorable sorts of ways. And the report by Flexner said that this country needs fewer and better doctors. In reality, what it also meant, particularly for women and African Americans, is the following. There were, at the time of the Flexner Report, 7 women's medical colleges. After the report, only one still existed, and that was the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, that then became the Medical College of Pennsylvania, then merged with Hahnemann, and then eventually became Drexel. So it had enormous consequences to women's medical education. In 1900, about 10 years prior to the report, roughly 5 or 6% of physicians in the United States were women. In 1915, right after the report, 2.9% of graduates were women. And that number didn't get above 5% until the 1970s. Similarly, for African Americans, there were 7 historically Black medical schools that were open prior to the report. Only Howard and Meharry remained after the report. And for 50 years, for the next 50 years, until 1965-ish, 75% of all Black physicians in the United States were graduates of Howard and Meharry. And if you read the report closely, there's all sorts of racism in it. So I don't mean to put the Flexner Report in as the gold standard for medical education, but to also say that there are consequences to what happened. So let me pivot now to thinking about how we think about the health humanities in our educational schemes and I think in our practice. And if folks are interested in the health humanities, you probably have thought about it in 2 general sorts of ways. Are these things instrumental for us, or is there an intrinsic value? Is there some sort of general way that it changes our ways of thinking, or can we use them for a specific thing? And in terms of utility, those specific things might be, for example, observation skills. Might our radiologists, for example, or dermatologists use the health humanities to help our students observe things in a different way than traditionally we do? Or perhaps use it to teach the history of medicine. I'll give examples of both of that. Perhaps we can use the health humanities as well to teach professionalism and ethics. We can use it to understand the condition of our patients and ourselves through narrative. I'm going to spend the most of our time thinking about this as a humanistic epistemology. How can we use the health humanities to understand our thinking about the nature of the work that we do about ourselves and our patients? And finally, empathy. And I'll go through each one of these and give examples of that, spending most of my time in the beginning on humanistic epistemology, and then spend the bulk of the rest of the session sort of talking about how one uses this and giving examples. So I mentioned observational skills. This is a painting by Jan van Eyck. Just as an example, we can see Canon van der Pijl over here. This is from the 1500s. And folks have used this to describe, perhaps this fine gentleman might have suffered from temporal arteritis. So this is an example of using art to potentially teach observational skills. Or here is a famous painting by Thomas Eakins. It's called The Gross Clinic. It's in Philadelphia from 1875. In many ways, one of the most famous American portraits, and Thomas Eakins was probably the premier American portrait artist of the 1900s, of the 19th century, excuse me. And here's Dr. Gross presiding over a surgery, and one could use this painting, as I sometimes do in seminars that I teach, to talk about the history of medicine, and to talk as well about the nature of society at the time. So we see this. We see in the audience some rapt and some not so rapt medical students, all white men, all of the physicians performing the care of this patient. It looks like a debridement of a case of osteomyelitis, with Dr. Gross standing heroically above the patient. And notice, maybe some folks will notice, there's a woman in the corner of the painting hiding her face, likely in horror at what's happening here. This is, we know from history, the patient's mom. Moving up about 15 or so years, here's another painting by Thomas Eakins, also in Philadelphia. This is the Agnew Clinic, another famous surgeon in Philadelphia at the time. Similar audience, all white men. But we see changes in medicine now. We see the beginnings of antisepsis. Everyone's wearing white coats. Things are a little different. We also can see the status of women being slightly different. In this case, there are two women in the picture, not just a cringing mom, but a nurse over here who's overseeing the procedure as well, and the patient as well, who's undergoing a mastectomy. So we can think of art, and we can spend a fair bit of time talking about the history of medicine and how they've changed over the course of these two very famous portraits. And I'll put them side by side for you there to look at. I mentioned before, we can think of the use of the humanity to think about professionalism and ethics. I'll just mention that. It's a whole another grand rounds in and of itself. And the reason we need to teach this is we as a profession are not always as professional and as ethical as we can. I love this particular painting because if you look close, it looks like just about everyone in this painting is cheating. Let me go back to that. It's really kind of a fun painting. So the reason we need to teach it is we need to teach professionalism in our field. And here's a quote from Dr. Cohn. Serious engagement with the health humanities offers a unique and compelling way to tap into the emotional dimension of the clinical encounter and can validate for students what it means to be and not just act like a humanistic professional. And that humanism provides the passion that animates authentic professionalism. Again, that's a whole topic in and of itself that's worth lots of exploration, but I just highlight it as a way to use the humanities in our education. You've probably encountered, maybe some of you practice narrative medicine to some degree, or narrative health, that you write, that you read stories about medical practice, about healing narratives, journey narratives, witnessing narratives, transformational narratives. Narrative medicine is an enormously popular way of understanding medical practice and understanding medical practitioners, and many schools incorporate that in their education of their students and other learners. And just as an example of that, one of my mentors from early on in my medical school education, John Stone, who was a poet and pediatric cardiologist. I'll read a little bit from a poem that he wrote, Gaudiamus Igitur, that would be read at Emory's medical school graduation every year. And I think it's really quite moving. Here's a little snippet of that. For there will be the arts, and some will call them soft data, whereas in fact, they are the hard data by which our lives are lived. For everyone comes to the arts too late. For you can be trained to listen only for the oboe out of the whole orchestra. For you may need to strain to hear the voice of the patient in the thin reed of his crying. For you will learn to see most acutely out of the corner of your eye, to hear best with your inner ear. Or another poem, this is by Rafael Campo, who's an infectious disease doc in Boston, and also an amazing poet. And this poem is called The Chart. It says 54-year-old obese Hispanic female. I wonder if they mean the one with long black braids, Peruvian, who sells tamales at the farmer's market. Tells me I'm too thin, I better eat. Or is she the Dominican with too much rouge and almost an almond eyes at the dry cleaners, who must have been so beautiful in her youth? Or maybe she's the Cuban lady, drunk on grief, who I've seen half asleep, alone as if that bench were only hers, the Parker home at last. Or else the Mexican who hoards the littered papers she collects and says they are her documents. If not, it could be that Colombian drug addict whose Spanish, even when she's high, is perfect. Or maybe she's the one who never says exactly where she's from, but who reminds me of my grandmother, poor but refined, lace handkerchief balled up in her plump hand, who died too young from a condition that some doctor knows in her chart overlooked. So examples of narrative medicine. I'm going to shift now to what I think for me is the most salient aspect of the humanities in our educational work, and has informed much of my work over the last several decades of my career. And I will introduce it with this little study that some of you might have heard of. It's now about 10 years old. It was little. I'm not sure I'm going to make much of it scientifically, but I think it's important to sort of think through. And it's a study by Kidd and Castano. It was published in Science about 12 years ago. And it looked at theory of mind. And our theory of mind is how one intuits or understands the motivations of another person. Folks who are particularly interested in theory of mind from a psychiatric perspective are folks often in the child and adolescent world who work with folks with autism spectrum disorders, pay a lot of attention to theory of mind. And in this study, we can think of a theory of mind in several ways. One is an affective theory of mind, an ability to detect and understand others' emotions, and a cognitive theory of mind, and to be able to infer and represent others' beliefs and intentions. And the idea is in the studies, can we teach theory of mind? Can we improve that in people? So they set up this little tiny study. I'm not making much of it from a scientific standpoint, but I am intrigued by it as an idea. And the idea behind the study is that can we improve theory of mind in folks, particularly by reading literary fiction? So the study was set up with 3 different arms. Folks who read literary fiction, which is fiction that won some sort of literary awards, non-literary fiction, and I'll sort of distinguish them even further by non-literary fiction would be sort of very clear. There was a bad guy, and the reason the guy was a bad guy was because he was a bad guy. There wasn't much depth to the fiction. And then the third arm was nonfiction. So folks were randomized to the various arms. I'll let you read the study at one point if you'd like, to say, would reading literary fiction actually change scores on tests for theory of mind? And lo and behold, yeah, they did. That folks improved on the various scores for theory of mind who read literary fiction versus non-literary fiction or nonfiction, with the idea that literary fiction made you question the motivations of the characters. It's like the villain in the story might have complex motivations and reasons for their actions. Things weren't clear, things were complex, and it required the reader to think in very complex sorts of ways. I find it really sort of an intriguing way of thinking about the nature of our work, and can we help our learners think more complexly about the nature of what they do? This is, as you can imagine, tied somewhat loosely to the ideas of emotional intelligence, which is the awareness of one's own emotions and the ability to control and express these emotions and to guide interpersonal relationships. And there's lots of data to show that higher emotional intelligence scores have been linked to better job satisfaction and work performance, not just in medicine, but in general. And we also have some data to show that burnout and emotional intelligence are correlated in the sense that those with higher emotional intelligence scores correlated with decreased burnout, particularly in this case, in this study with surgical residents. And there was not any association between burnout and milestone scores or AppSpsych, which are in-service surgical exams, or USMLE scores. So just to sort of give us a little bit of scientific data to invoke episteme in thinking about the nature of what we're doing. So now I'm going to talk again about the thing that intrigues me most about the nature of what I try to teach my medical students and residents, and that is, how can we think about the liberal arts and the scholarly traditions of the liberal arts, the epistemology of the humanities, and what does that mean? How does learning that potentially help a growing and developing learner? And for the scholarly traditions of the liberal arts, we can think of them in 2 general sorts of ways. The first 5 are what we would normally think of as critical. How can we approach the thing that we're studying from a critical perspective? And the last 2 are how can we approach that what we're studying, not only from a critical perspective, but from an appreciative perspective as well. So I'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail to sort of help us understand what is involved in the mind of a liberal arts person, in how they're approaching the nature of their knowledge, and to how maybe that we can think of these things in conjunction with both techne and episteme, and that in concert All of these things can shape the way psychiatrists or psychologists or mental health professionals in general think about the nature of their work and their patients. So I'll go through each of these one at a time and talk about those. So probably the most, or at least certainly one of them, is that in the liberal arts tradition, there is very much a tradition of interpretation, that the liberal arts and the humanities are concerned very much with meaning and value. And I put this slide, this is a painting by René Magritte. It's called Treachery of Images. And you don't need to speak French to know what the words mean. Ceci n'est pas une pipe, is this is not a pipe. And most folks look at it and say, okay, and Magritte was a surrealist, who knows what he's talking about. But the painting, I think, sort of gets to a really interesting idea. What it sort of gets to is, what is the nature of meaning? What is a pipe? What is actually going on here? And that meaning is always sort of deferred in this painting. And that meaning can always be interpreted again and again and again. So if you think about this, you look at it and say, yeah, it's not a pipe, it's a painting. And then you look at it more and say, well, the word pipe is a word. It isn't the actual thing. It's a representation of the actual thing. So now we're sort of two steps away. It's a painting as a representation. The word is a representation of the painting of the thing. And then you can go to even further, and the pronoun this, cc, is a representation of the noun pipe. And Magritte's playing with this idea of representation, that everything constantly has further meanings to it. You can take it even further with this, is that, and this is a thought that's popular in psychoanalytic circles. I'm trained as a psychoanalyst, that everything that we think and do has multiple meanings and multiple functions. That things are never simple, that they're never clear. There's never a simple concordance between this and that. So the common idea in psychoanalysis that, or the portrayal of psychoanalysis, which is incredibly unanalytic, which is, I had a dream about the Eiffel Tower, that must have some phallic meaning to it. For analytic thought, and I think for humanistic and liberal arts traditions, the Eiffel Tower in your dream likely has many, many meanings and many functions. In this way of thinking of interpretation and the multiples of meaning about things, that there's always a recognition and a negotiation between different perspectives, how we see things and how we understand our perspectives and experiences. And using another line from Marianne Moore's poem that I referenced earlier in poetry, that we need to become literalists of the imagination, similarly to the imaginary gardens with real toads, to understand that what we're dealing with in the human condition is both real and imagined, both of which are incredibly important for us to understand ourselves and for us to understand our patients. So one tradition in the liberal arts is that things are interpretive and concerned with meaning and value. There's also very much an insistence on context and contingency. As opposed to episteme, which is generally context independent, the humanities very much want to understand the specific in light of the general. That we're not thinking of general laws, but we're also thinking of what's happening here. And that things are understood, importantly, not just generally, but in relation to history, to language, to race, culture, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, religion, family of origin, time, ability or disability, privilege or status, or any number of other qualifiers. That we're always radically looking at the unique human being in front of us, or the unique piece of art, how it relates to others around it, and not it as a general thing. We could look at this Paul Klee painting, which is called Twittering Machine, and say, yes, here are the pigments in it, and these pigments are the same pigments that are used in other paintings. That's one way of thinking about it. Or what's radically unique about this particular work, or even more so, what's radically unique about the human being that we're trying to understand and help. A third key component of the humanities traditions is what the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur described as a hermeneutic of suspicion, meaning that we approach everything that we see with the idea that there's always more going on, that there's no, that it's never the end of the story by just saying, okay, here it is. So a zillion years ago, there was the show Dragnet, and there was always the detective who would, just as an aside, always in an incredibly sexist way, because would say to a hysterical woman who had just witnessed a crime or was the victim of a crime, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, don't tell me the story. We can, again, talk about the sexism inherent in the Dragnet episode, but what we're trying to say here is that it is never just the facts. There's always more to the story. Even when we think we have the end of the story, there's always more to the story. And that in a hermeneutic of suspicion, meaning is often hidden to both the subject and the object. Those folks who do psychotherapy know this intrinsically in our work. When our patients say things, we know that there's always hidden meanings in what they say, and that these meanings are not necessarily easily available to us or to our patients, but that exploration of them is important. There is an acknowledgement of inherent prejudices in the ability to know. I'll talk a little bit about that in a different slide down the road. And what underlines all of the hermeneutic of suspicion in the nature of our work, there's always, always, always uncertainty, skepticism, and doubt. Even when we say to ourselves, we understand this, we got the techne, and we even got the episteme, we also have to remember that there are things that we're not sure about, and that what underlies this hermeneutic of suspicion, hermeneutic is a way of knowing, is uncertainty, skepticism, and doubt. Further, the humanities traditions and liberal arts traditions are radically connected to the past and to history. In a very broad way, we can think of science as an endeavor for discovery. How can we discover something new? Episteme is about, in many ways, discovery. Phronesis, and I would say the liberal arts traditions as a whole, is partially about discovery, but as well about recovery. What can we learn from the past? That our work is in constant dialogue with the past. So that in a very overly simplistic way, and I know this is much more complicated than I'm about to say, Einstein in many ways replaced Newton. Einstein gave us a much more sophisticated way of thinking about physics, and we study Newton as an introduction or as part of the historical narrative, but we study Einstein when we want to learn about physics. That's different in the humanities. We don't study Toni Morrison because she replaced Shakespeare. We study Toni Morrison because she's part of a chain of authors that are in dialogue with one another. She's not better or worse than Shakespeare. She's part of a tradition, and that her writing can be understood through reading or informed in part through reading Shakespeare, or the other way around. And that the humanities traditions very much add as much as replace in the nature of the work. And that ultimately these traditions are intrinsically relational. I'll give sort of a fun example of that using etymology. The word troth, which is an Old English word from which we get the word truth, or we might see it in parts of words like betrothal, meaning marriage. The old word troth in English meant a pledge or a promise between two people. It didn't mean a fact. It meant an agreed upon idea between two folks that morphed over time for us to get the word truth. The truth, again, thinking about it in this sort of fun kind of way, comes from an idea of an agreement, not as fact. And then again, similarly to as I mentioned before, that one cannot radically distinguish the observed from the observer, the self from the object. That we, in our work, in relating to our patients, always bring ourselves to that. And that it's never this clear distinction between who we are as a dispassionate observer and our patients. We bring ourselves, which from our psychotherapeutic standpoint, clearly leads into ideas of transference and countertransference, that as much as we might strive to be objective in the nature of our understandings of our work, we always, our instrument, our lens is always clouded by us. So those are the five sort of critical ways that the humanities traditions approach their work, either through studies of history, studies of philosophy, art, you name it. But they don't stop there. And this, I think, is also important for us to keep in mind, that there's also a spirit of appreciative inquiry. You guys might have in college or high school or even before taken an art appreciation or a music appreciation class, which is involved in aesthetics and making judgments that are both critical but also sympathetic. To say what might be actually valuable or even what might be beautiful about something. That's not something in medicine we do often. Most of our work very much tries to shy away from these sort of appreciative assessments. And just as an example in how one might think of this in our work, perhaps bringing in an appreciation of strengths and health, as much as an appreciation for an understanding of illness and weakness. That what if we spend some time saying to ourselves, what's going right here as much as what is pathological or going wrong? So a spirit of appreciative inquiry. And then finally, an idea that I'm sure you all are very familiar with, which is epistemic humility, to be humble in what we know and as much as what we do not know, to not be fooled into thinking we've got it all figured out, and to be always asking ourselves, what is it that we don't know, knowing that that question is always going to be endless. There's always more that we don't know. Brings in the concept of epistemic and testimonial injustice. Who can tell their story? Whose story is valuable? Whose story is listened to? Whose story is not? And why? And what the settings are. Just as an example, in mental health, when our patients come in who might be suffering with schizophrenia, for example, do we listen to their story or do we hear schizophrenia? Are we committing testimonial injustice when we say your story is not a valid one? It might not be a helpful one at 2 o'clock in the morning in the emergency, but be mindful about how we listen to stories and who's able to tell them and what stories are given priority. And then tied with that, obviously, cultural humility, a concept that's now much more popular than it was years ago when we talked about cultural competences. So a sense of before things that I don't know, as opposed to, I've got this figured out. I read a paragraph in my textbook on this particular group. I know them. So with that as background, I'm going to give some examples of the work that I do. I run a seminar with our PGY3s weekly where I bring in, and sometimes they bring in, works of art or poetry or stories or things that they've created or read that intrigue them, that help them understand the human condition. And I put up this slide importantly because I find it to be one of the most and I say this very much tongue-in-cheek, problematic pieces of science in the last 100 or so years. This is one of Einstein's gray papers from 1905. It does the inertia of a body depend upon its energy content. It is what became E equals mc squared. It is the heart and soul of special relativity. Obviously, relativity is all involved in what I've been talking about. I say why this paper is incredibly problematic, not for the political or potential uses of E equals mc squared, but because it's incredibly beautiful. And it is 3 pages. There's not a footnote in it. These are the entire 3 pages of E equals mc squared. We have the idea from this in a general sort of way, and I'm not disparaging, I'm obviously playing with this idea, but the paper tells us that things ought to be simple. And here's an example of absolute simplicity. I mean, I don't understand the physics, but you can see in 3 pages that this is an incredibly elegant idea and things are simple. What I've been trying to say, and will continue to say for the next 15 or so minutes that I'm talking, is the human condition is inordinately complicated. It isn't this. And for us to think of the human condition or anything that we do as medicine as this misses the human being. I want to be very clear that I think there's an enormous role for science in the nature of psychiatry and medicine. It will not, we would not be practicing psychiatry if we were not scientists. Science underlies what we do. Technique underlies what we do, but also an appreciation for the complexities of the human condition underlie what we do. So, so anyway, please keep that in mind, that the nature of what we do is really, really complicated. So I often, now I'll go through several examples of what we talk about in our seminar. It's a seminar with our PGY3s. I do it weekly with them. For the first 2/3 or so of the seminar, I bring in pieces from the liberal arts traditions, short stories, poems, art, songs, music, and we talk about them. What's really fun about it, I think, at least fun for me, is I am not an art historian. I am not an English professor. I like those sorts of things. I've studied it some, but that's not my area of expertise. I'm a psychiatrist and physician. But we talk about them not from the perspective that an English professor might or might not, but what can this particular work of art or product or whatever it might be help us understand about the human condition. The idea is we in psychiatry have been doing this for a couple hundred years now. We have one method of doing it. There have been folks around the globe for many, many thousands of years also trying to understand the complexities of the human condition and what can we learn about them from as physicians or mental health care practitioners that might inform our work. Often these things are not medically related. Some are, but most are not. They're not stories of doctors or stories of patients. Those are really interesting as well. But I try to go a little further and say, what do folks who are not physicians help us understand about what it means to be a person? So I'll go through some examples of that in not great detail, just to give you a sense, and would love to talk more in detail if folks would like about any of the works. So I'll just I often start with the Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe. It's the first detective story, the first modern detective story written in the 1830s by Poe. If you read it, you will say, oh, yeah, this is your typical detective story. There's the Watson character and the Sherlock Holmes character. This is actually all before Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes works. It's sort of where detective stories come from. And it's a story about how a particular detective solves a particular case. And it compares this particular detective, Auguste Dupin, with the prefect of police. Prefect of police very much stands in for the modern, at least at the time, scientific way of understanding. He's really good at being a police detective and does all of the cool science that is needed to solve the case, but ends up not being able to solve it. But the hero, Dupin, solves the case by thinking about what it means, what the criminal eventually, it's a really intricate, lovely story, I encourage you to read, but by empathizing with the mind of the criminal and how might the criminal think about things. And then I ask my students to sort of wonder, who would you rather see as a psychiatrist, the empathic and understanding detective or the prefect of police who's knowledgeable in all of the scientific ways of understanding what people do? It's a false question because the answer for me is some combination of both. We want our psychiatrist to be both the hero of the story, the detective, and the prefect. But I'll leave you to read it. It's wonderful. It also has an incredibly important academic life. Folks in the English and French departments have been writing about this story for decades and decades and decades. So long literature in academic English departments. I spend a fair bit of time as well with this painting. I'll just talk about it very briefly. It's Las Maninas by Diego Velázquez, probably the most famous painting in Spanish art. In many ways, it's considered one of the most important paintings in the Western art canon. It is really quite fascinating. It's a painting, I usually sort of approach this, I'll be really, really brief about it, as to who the subject of the painting is. And the painting's actually quite disorienting when you think about it. Most folks say the subject is this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this little girl in the front, who's actually the crown princess of Spain. This is the king and queen of Spain's only child. And most folks think, oh, it's a portrait of her. But when you really start exploring this painting in depth, it's incredibly complicated, and it's very different than any other painting of the royal family in the Western tradition of the 1600s. Normally, you'd see the king and queen on a throne looking regal. This is a behind-the-scenes view of that, including it, and all of the folks in this painting are historical, real people. So there's a ton going on. But anyway, the idea of the subject of the painting is really quite disorienting because what it does is you think it's the little girl, but then you start looking at it a little further. She's looking out at something else, and then you notice that there's actually an artist in the painting as well who's painting something. He's looking out as well. Who is he looking at, and why? And then we have a clue. If we look sort of right there, smack dab in the middle of the painting right here, is a mirror. And in the mirror is a reflection of the king and queen, who are standing out here looking at this behind the scenes version of things in their palace. And so It's sort of a painting of the king and queen. It's sort of a painting of the painter itself. You wonder what's on the other side of that easel. That's always a question. And then you wonder about where the king and queen are, who these other people are. And then equally, it's a painting about the viewer. Is everyone looking at the viewer? Are they looking at the king and queen? If the king and queen are standing out here, who's standing next to him? Us, the viewer. Does that put the viewer of the painting at the same level as the king and queen of Spain? And if you remember your history, being king and queen of Spain in 1656 was a pretty big deal. And they wouldn't be standing next to viewers, but Velázquez in this subverts all of those ideas. So not only is it an incredible aesthetic work, it's an incredible work on the theory of viewership, the theory of subjectivity, how we understand things. You can go on and on and on and on, and lots of folks have, but I'll leave it at that. I then bring in this painting, which is a contemporary painting by Kerry James Marshall, who's an American painter, which is, I sometimes erroneously, this is his version of Las Meninas, but this is very much influenced by Las Meninas, and it's his playing with the exact same ideas. You can even see in this sort of little figure here, if you can see it, a little blonde-headed girl that is the Princess of Spain floating there in this beauty parlor. And if you look closely at the painting, it plays with the exact same ideas, with the mirrors, with sort of this behind the scenes, who's where, who's the viewer, who's doing what. And it's Kerry James Marshall, who's an amazing, again, American painter, playing with these very same ideas. If you remember, and I guess we'll go here, oops, and go back to Las Meninas. All of these paintings in Las Meninas are real paintings in the palace. Similarly, in Marshall's version of School of Beauty, School of Culture, the paintings in here are real. This is a real painting at the Tate by Chris O'Feely. So very much asks you to think about the viewer, what's being viewed, who's being viewed, what does that mean? These are incredibly intellectually sophisticated works. I then spend, in a different session, a fair bit of time on Wallace Stevens as a poet, because I just kind of like Wallace Stevens, and I'll read this poem. This is his last published poem. It was published in the Atlantic in the 1950s. It's called July Mountain. We live in a constellation of patches and of pitches, not in a single world, in things said well in music, on the piano, and in speech, as in a page of poetry, thinkers without final thoughts, in an always incipient cosmos, the way when we climb a mountain, Vermont throws itself together. In the interest of time, I'll just say this is a poem that's very short. It's pretty much, it's one sentence. It's all about the nature of perspective and how we create the world that we see. The world is out there. The world of episteme is out there. The world of techne is out there. But we create the world. And the image that he starts with is the idea of constellations. He looks up in the sky, sees the stars, and says, that's Leo. That makes sense. I put that together, and that's Leo. That's the constellation Leo. That's a lion. The stars don't know it's a lion. The stars, it's not any more than Vermont knows it's Vermont. But we create Vermont as we climb a mountain because we see it in different ways. We make it such. And to be thinking about those ideas, we can spend lots of time talking about that. I'll very briefly talk about perspective again, this time using music, two pieces of music by John Cage, the American composer. The first is 433 that you probably all heard about or heard. It's where usually a pianist gets on stage and sits at the piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, not playing the piano. Folks start coughing, fidgeting in their seats, moving. This is John Cage, amongst many things, it's John Cage's way of saying what's happening between the notes, what's going on, not just in the notes that's played on the piano, but the background. And for us as psychiatrists and psychologists, think about what's happening between the words, what's happening between the notes. And then similarly, another piece also by John Cage, it's an organ piece. ASLSP is his version of as slow as possible. You might be able to see some of the numbers here. Those are actually years. This is a piece that's currently being performed in a church in Germany by an organ. The notes change every couple of years. It's to be played over 639 years. It gives us a sense that most of what we hear, let's say in music, or how we interact with the world, is on human time. Cage is saying, well, that's not just, the world is more complicated than human time. This is a piece that's to be heard over 639 years. It isn't 630, it isn't a million different notes. It's just these notes are played incredibly slowly. So every couple of years they change the notes. There's this big deal in the church in Germany. Again, as slow as possible if you want to read about that. I'm going to skip over this famous painting by Rembrandt about the anatomy lesson. And here, using another painting by Kerry James Marshall, sort of interrogates the Rembrandt painting. It's called Beauty Examined, and brings in all kinds of ideas about subjectivity, about race, about racism, and it's a real spectacular painting in conversation with the Rembrandt painting. So you can see the two of them obviously connected. I do spend a seminar day on the poem and sung by Billie Holiday called "Strange Fruit." Hopefully, most of you have heard it. It was originally written as a poem by a guy. Not his sort of pen name is Lewis Aaron, but the guy who wrote it his name is Abel Meeropol. I'll read it and tell you a little bit about him. It's a spectacularly beautiful song that if you listen to the words, you sort of think of in really very different ways than Billie Holiday's incredibly haunting, beautiful version of it. But then begin to think of, what is she singing about? Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves, blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias sweet and fresh, and the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, and for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, and for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Incredibly haunting poem, inspired by postcards of a lynching that Abel Meeropol saw and was terribly moved by. Abel Meeropol was an English teacher at Wade Clinton High School in the Bronx in New York. Went on, wrote a number of other poems and some other things that became songs. This obviously became his most famous when Billie Holiday and then Nina Simone and a whole bunch of other folks used it. Incredibly powerful. Maybe in some ways the one of the most important songs in the American Songbook. Just a quick tangential aside, because I like little bits of trivia. Abel Meeropol and his wife. One, he went to high school with County Cullen, the Harlem Renaissance poet, and taught James Baldwin. So he had those sorts of claims to fame as well as writing this song. But he and his wife adopted Ethel and Julius Rosenberg's children after they were killed in the electric chair in the 50s. So those folks that remember American history and know the story of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, their orphan children were adopted by Abel Meeropol and his wife. They changed their name to Meeropol, and I believe those children, they're still, I think they're probably well in their 80s now, but they're still alive. I then, I'll not, in the interest of time, sort of just highlight Gretel and Darkness, which is my introduction to a session that we do on trauma. It's a poem. It's an incredibly deep poem. It's a retelling, or maybe what's happened now, of the Hansel and Gretel fable. So it's, where are they now? Where's Hansel and where's Gretel now? And it's by Louise Gluck, who a couple of years ago won the Nobel Prize for literature. Wonderful, spectacular poem that I very much urge you to read. Incredibly deep, but it's a retelling, or maybe not a retelling, but where are they now, about Hansel and Gretel. And Gretel and Hansel are in very different places. And it's a way of looking at their situation while they're fine and safe and back in Dad's house and everything's okay. Gretel's not doing doing well. We can think of Gretel as having post-traumatic stress disorder or some other traumatic sequelae of her experiences. And it plays with the ideas of trauma. It plays as well with the ideas and differences, at least from Gluck's perspective, of the masculine and feminine, how men and women are portrayed and thought of differently, the nature of what safety is, and the differences between psychological and physical safety. I very much urge you to read it. So we talk about that. Then combined in that particular day, we look at a couple of paintings. This is our trauma day. We look at Guernica, which is Picasso's great painting of the firebombing of the town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War by the Nazis. And sort of the history of this painting and how incredibly visceral it is. And then compare it to this painting by an American painter, Faith Ringgold, who just recently passed away, mostly known for her quilting work, incredible artist. It's part of a series of paintings called Die. Just sort of as an interesting historical aside, Guernica was brought to the United States before the war to save it from destruction during the Second World War, and stayed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York for decades and decades. Picasso didn't want it to go back to Spain until the Franco government had fallen and that the fascists had eventually left Spain. Eventually that happened and Guernica was returned to Spain. But that was not until relatively recently. I guess the 70s or 80s, it left New York to go back to Spain. This painting, which depicts the unrest of the 1967, 66 and 67 summers, this particularly of the unrest in Newark, New Jersey. Those folks, again, that know history knew about the problem, the circumstances in Detroit or Watts or Newark or any number of other cities. And this was inspired, this is her version of Guernica, similar scene of horror. And what's really interesting, the Metropolitan Museum has been redone since, but the curators there hung Faith Ringgold's painting, which is roughly the same size as Guernica, both are huge, in the same spot that Guernica was, to give it sort of pride of place. And then finally, I'll wrap up really quick. I spend another session on Hokusai and the 36 views of Mount Fuji, again, thinking about perspective, going through the various woodblock prints, and connecting it as well, getting back to Wallace Stevens, to one of his most famous paintings, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Again, thinking about the ideas of, can we see the same thing from very different perspectives, but are they the same thing? And what does that mean to see it in Hokusai's way from, Mount Fuji from 36 different views? Or in this case, for Blackbird, what does it mean for Stevens to think of it in 13? So I'm going to wrap up real quick with two more things. One is this, as I said before, I'm a psychoanalyst by training and by inclination. So I love this little snippet. It's from Pseudo-Plutarch in the Lives of the 10 Orders. While Antiphon was still occupying himself with poetry, he invented a method for curing mental distress, no different in its way from being treated for a physical ailment by a doctor. He built himself premises near the Agora in Corinth and posted an advertisement for the effect that he had found, and I love this, a talking cure for distress. That's right up my analytic alley, although this is 2,500 years before. And then by delving into the reasons for their distress, he used to bring his patients relief. And this is the kicker of the sentence, but he considered this profession beneath his dignity and turned to oratory instead. So I love that. And then I'm going to leave you with one final poem. This is by Joy Harjo, Native American poet. She was Poet Laureate of the United States for a number of terms. And we'll end with Perhaps the World Ends Here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of the earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating at the last sweet bite. And we'll end there. And for folks that are interested in the works of art, here's all of them. And if folks have questions about where they are, who painted them, and this is the wrap up. So I will end there a little bit over time, so I apologize, and I will stop sharing. So I'm open for questions if folks have them. Hopefully that was, I was going to say, hopefully that was clear. I actually hope that was a little confusing and made things more complicated, which is my goal. That we as humans are complicated, and hopefully you walk out with more questions than answers.
Thank you, Dr. Furman. Some very, very powerful pieces and messages in there.
Thank you.
We have a message of thanks in the chat by Colleen Doyle. It says, thank you for this incredible talk on the nourishing bites and vital tools the humanities offer us to fuel and enhance our work. All right. Let's see if anybody has any questions. And Dr. Garrity says, you met your goal. I'm delightfully confused and interested.
Good. I think that's good.
Somebody has their hand up, Lionel. Can we? Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Thanks very much for this presentation, Dr. Furman. I'm a clinical psychologist who works with psychology learners, but also many psychiatry residents.
Right.
Many years ago, a director of the Columbia Psychoanalytic Center did a study of medical students' dreams and found that in the beginning of med school, they imagined themselves performing surgeries, much like the pictures that you presented. And then as they progressed through medical school, towards the end, they imagined themselves more as the patient on the table. How do you understand that? And is that the correct direction that we should continue with our residents in residency training? And of course, with the understanding that we can affect their dreams.
Sure. I'll answer that. I can answer in a number of ways, and I'll think of it in two different, in the spirit of, again, the humanities, and with multiple meanings. One can think of their dreams sort of changing into being the patient as an evolution of empathy, a growth towards relatedness, a way of thinking of their connections with their patients. That's certainly one way of reading it, of hearing the material, and to think of, okay, cool. Our educational system is helping our learners grow and develop as empathic and connected practitioners. That's one way of hearing it or reading that particular material. I also hear it, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive, as a comment on the brutality of medical education. So that you could read it as, here I come in, this heroic person who's going to save my patients, and actually what's happened is I've been brutalized and taken apart and cut up by a difficult system. I think both can be true at the same time in our learners' dreams. And an analyst would say, yeah, they're both likely, and then any number of other things might be going on. And if I were the analyst listening to an individual medical student's dream, I wouldn't interpret the dream as a dream in and of itself. I would be wondering, why is this person telling me that this idea this morning in my office, this Wednesday morning, for example? What's going on in their life that has prompted them to recall this particular phenomena and tell me this particular story? So the story at that moment might say more about the brutality of of their surgical rotation, and why having to be in the hospital at 4 a.m. to stand around with a retractor for 10 hours doing nothing other than cramping and then being told nasty things by a surgeon is brutal. And or it might be, hey, I've developed empathy and concern for my patients. I am more aware of the complexities of our relationship. Who knows? All of those could be going on. That's how I'd hear it. And that's how I'd wonder if this were either a learner or more accurately, I guess, a patient. I'd explore all of those potential meanings. I don't know if that gets to your answers your question or
Natalie does.
That's exactly what I would have said. No. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I have a question. I was wondering if your choice of including Gordon Parks in one of the photos was intentional for this talk. I think that the guy with the photography was Gordon Parks. So he's a Minnesota-born, very famous photographer. And would you like to comment on use of photography for those who are not gifted with words?
Right, sure. I did not consciously know that Gordon Parks was from Minnesota. And I do not know much about Gordon Parks. I was intrigued by the photograph and felt that it fit in well with, let's look at how the health humanities looks at things. So I was sort of more focused on the photographer with the camera than the person of Gordon Parks. But I can tell you I spent a fair bit of time trying to incorporate Bob Dylan in this, but thought that was going to be a little too obvious as the Minnesota native. And I can tell you I'm a huge fan, but then said to myself, I'm going to very much not. But I guess I just did it.
Dr. Furman,
Would you like to add something specifically about Gordon Parks that is important to you?
Well, I'm interested in photography, so that's one of it, and that's how I learned about Gordon Parks, that he actually is from Minnesota. I have seen a number of his photos, and I recommend for people to look at them because they are very, they give different perspectives, as you were saying, and I think that they really add the depth to the thinking about human existence.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
we have a question in the chat from Dr. Zalowska. I'm curious if any art or stories brought by residents has been very impactful or memorable for you as an instructor.
Many have. It is so the seminar is, again, roughly 2/3 of the first 2/3 or so. I bring in pieces like I just showed you, and they often and then I ask them to bring in things. Sometimes they're created by the resident themselves or the medical student, which is always really incredibly powerful. To me, what's most powerful, and there are lots of different pieces that they brought in, is they reconnect with something or share something that is meaningful to them, to a group of their peers who they've known by this time, they're PGY3 several years, that group didn't know was meaningful to them and why. And got a chance to talk about it I think in deep ways. So what it does is it fosters connections not only to the work, to one's own ways of thinking, but to one's peers as well. And let me also say, just it's somewhat tangential idea to that, that the seminar started many decades ago as an add-on to a case conference that I had done, an analytically oriented case conference with the residents. So we do the case conference, and then I'd say, oh, I'm interested in this kind of stuff. Let's spend the last couple of minutes talking about a poem or a piece of art or something, and found that the residents, at least at the time, were much freer to talk about their personal experiences reading a poem, about what the poem might be about, or the photograph, or the story, in terms of sharing their subjective experience and their understanding of meaning in looking at a poem or another piece of art, than they were in talking about the case history of the patient that one of them is treating. With the idea being that they were a little freer because it was a touch more distant from their day-to-day clinical work, to share their experiences of the humanity and the subjectivity of what they were reading or experiencing with art than they were with patients. And that then allowed them to use those same skills to look at the clinical material in slightly different ways.
Hi, this is Kate Powell, the residency program director.
Hey.
And I'm having a hard time putting my thoughts into words, but I'm gonna try.
Okay.
So, it's really pervasive that medical education and residency education needs to use adult learning principles. One of those being what you teach needs to have a practical application, that they're either applying what you're teaching to a case they've worked with recently or will, use in the future. And I even noticed as you're giving this talk that one of the first things that you have to address is how, what is the utility of teaching humanities?
Mhm.
So how do you kind of challenge the idea that everything that we need to teach needs to have a practical application, or or kind of get people to focus on what you learn doesn't need to have a clear use right away, but everything is still useful?
Right. Your question is incredibly important, not just for obviously the medical education or the residence education in psychiatry. It's important nowadays in terms of higher education in general. And it's a crisis that's happening across the country in higher education. Is what is the nature of a collegiate or university education? Why are we recommending this to our young folks? And that's an incredibly important question. As you can probably tell, maybe well, hopefully you were able to tell that my stance isn't one of utility exactly. So that's why I sort of said, oh, we can look and use this for observational skills and learn about that. That's great. There's a place for that, and that's wonderful. What I prefer is that it changes the way people think, and it changes the way people look at the world. And for us in psychiatry, it changes the way that we practice what we do and how we think about our patients. And that the utility, if there is one, is that we think of the world in a more complex way. I guess that's a use. I think of it partially as that, and partially a way of thinking. I've now helped someone think about the world in different ways, and now they can then use that in helpful ways with their clinical or academic work. So I absolutely understand I think I understand your question. We in education, you guys there, we at Emory, everyone around the country, certainly in higher education, is wrestling with that exact thing. Is what we teach training, or is it what we're doing education? Are we helping people think in more complex ways in all the various disciplines that we do, or are we training them to do a specific task? And in medicine, I hope we do both. We need the task, we need the techne and episteme, but we very much also need the complexity of phronesis.
Kind of like an off-the-wall follow-up question, but do you know if there are like different cognitive processes involved with studying humanities versus like what we're typically doing with categorizing? And
I don't know the answer to that, but I'd love to sort of try to investigate that some.
We have another comment in the chat, Dr. Furman, from Dr. Ziad Nahas. Excellent talk. And it comes with a recommendation, Art and Physics, Parallel Visions in Space, Time and Light by Leonard Slane.
Okay.
Artists often pick up on fundamental aspects of the physical world well before scientists advance their observations and theories. Similarly, analysts have paid attention to phenomena that only now neuroscience is starting to understand.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Well, let's see if anybody else has any questions. I have an unrelated question.
Sure.
What is the origin of the chessboard behind you?
My father-in-law traveled as a businessman and got that in Japan.
In Japan.
So it is, I will admit, if everyone can keep the secret, it's performative. I am not a chess player. I know how to play. And when I play, which is every couple of years, I play poorly. But it makes folks think that I'm thinking deeply about things, and that I'm like 2 steps ahead, when reality is, I think it's pretty and reminds me of my father-in-law.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how many countries produce different artistic forms of wooden chessboards.
Yeah.
I know there's many from India. So,
Yeah.
well, I think on that note, I would like to thank you from all of us here for this wonderful talk. And I hope you enjoyed your visit with us.
I certainly have. My pleasure. And thanks again for inviting me.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fu.
Bye-bye.
Take care.